So how would you get there? Let's say you're using Vault today. Most of you on this that are watching live now probably are using Vault today. You're not using items. So if you wanted to start using items, you would need to transition, right? In my experience, most of our customers that are using Vault Professional are using revision control in some way, right? You're changing files from work to release and keeping track of revisions. If you are not doing so today, right? If you are not tracking revisions on your files in Vault today, and they're all just, especially if they're all just in the base category, I would strongly consider using items before you implement any sort of file lifecycle behavior, because it would be very straightforward for you to transition to items if you're not using any behaviors at all, right? So, but most organizations have many existing files with existing behaviors. Those files are already in life cycles. They're already in, they've already got revision history, et cetera, right? And then, you know, if we're talking about extracting a bill of materials from CAD files into Vault, if your CAD BOM isn't in any state that you could use, you know, that has any use to you outside of CAD, then, you know, that's something to consider as well, right? So in order to get from file behaviors to item behaviors, you don't have to do it this way, but this is the way I would say the workflow works best and is the smoothest. Typically, you would want to remove any behaviors on the existing files. You might want to move the category to the base category. You know, the item could carry the category that part or file should otherwise have, because we're talking about going from a file, right? And one interesting thing about categorization with Vault, and this is getting down a bit into the weeds of how Vault works, but with Vault, when you want to put a file into a category, the rules for categorizing files, you can set up rules. You can say, if this file has a, you know, a property called category and its name is part, then put it in a part category. Or if this file ends in .ipt, put it in the part category. And if it ends in .iam, put it in the assembly category. So you can categorize files automatically. And I would say most vaults that are taking advantage of life cycles have those rules in place, but you can only automatically categorize when the file comes into the vault based on the information that is on the file when it comes into Vault. Otherwise, you have to use the change category command, and then you can reapply the rules if you want to, right? But in some cases, depending on what your workflow in Vault needs to be, you know, it can be a little bit painful to get the files categorized automatically. You may not even necessarily know what category the file should be in the first time you check it into Vault. With items, you know, you have, you know, all the time in the world to get the file correct and its properties correct before you create an item from it. And then the item can be based, category can be based on any of the file properties. So, you know, that's one way to get the right behavior on a record right out of the gate once you start applying behaviors, is to use items, right? So that's an interesting thing about categories and Vault. So again, when we're talking about transition, you know, your file behavior needs to go away. That would be the category, and typically the lifecycle definition and revision scheme would also go away. Again, it's easiest to use if the Vault item controls revision, file access, state, etc., right? And then once the behavior is removed from the file, you would assign the item. If it's something that has an existing revision history and you need to get the current revision level of the item, you know, on the item, you can use change revision command and even use a file UDP to set that revision. And then you would, you know, set the final lifecycle state. So, you know, there's a bit of work involved in making that transition. But again, if you're not using Vault lifecycles at all right now and you plan to start sometime soon, definitely rule out items. Say, take a good look at items, and then decide you don't want to use them before you start applying file-based behaviors. It'll just be an easier transition. If your workflow is typically project-based, like you create documents, you execute a project, and then you're done with it, and you typically don't touch that data again for a while or ever, then typically what you do is create items of your standard parts. The files can still participate in whatever method they need to in existing projects, whatever, right? And then when you start new projects, just go ahead and start, the item behavior with new projects going forward. When you are transitioning, it's often best to start with higher level assemblies, because that will let you create many items at once, right? Because when you assign an item to a file in Vault, it needs to build the bill of materials for that entire structure. So if I have an assembly that describes 1,000 pieces, and I want to create items of that, starting at a higher level, even potentially at the top, could end up with a lot of created items without a lot of clicking, right? And then for those situations where you may have, duplicate files in the Vault that describe, that have the same part number that kind of got scattered around, the item records are a way to sort of consolidate that data, because depending on how you configure your Vault, if you have two different CAD files that represent the same part number, whether they're actually different or if they're accidental copies, you would end up with only one part number in the item master, and both of those files would be linked to that one part number, right? So that's a way to sort of factor out some duplicates and even potentially expose some duplicates or help you understand duplicates, along with the duplicate search behavior in Vault can help with that too. But if you've got a lot of behaviors you need to change, like a ton of files and it's complex, if the change as you go isn't quite an option, you can use some bulk data migration tools that we could help you with here at Hagerman, some scripting to help change behaviors of things in Vault. So, if you're not sure, like if you really want to use items, but you're concerned about the difficulty of making this transition, we can talk, one-on-one to help you understand what it would take you to move to items and give you some recommendations on the best way to get there.